The gist of the recommendations in the area of missile defense was what principles might guide American, Russian, or NATO-Russian cooperation in the missile defense area. And there were 5 or 6 specific principles laid out. One was that they concentrate on missile defense against intermediate range or shorter range missiles, not try to address strategic range, because that gets into the difficult question, are we helping each other defend against our own strategic deterrent? It's also easier for the United States and Russia to have a discussion about defending against intermediate range nuclear missiles, because as a result of the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, neither side has any missiles in that category. So that was the first principle, what they ought to be looking at in terms of the threat. The second principle was talking about transparency, and it's regarding transparency about systems and capabilities on both sides. The United States ought to be prepared to talk about what the standard SM-3 missile can do in terms of its ability to deal with ballistic missiles. But as sometimes gets lost in the conversation, there are also Russian missile systems like the S-300, the S-400, which have capabilities. What capabilities do they have? And then to tie this in with some transparency with regards to possible deployment options. I don't think the U.S. military has decided exactly what that specific architecture for missile defense in 2020 looks like. But it certainly ought to have some idea of what the options are, and having a degree of transparency on that might facilitate cooperation between Washington and Moscow or between NATO and Moscow. Another principle was that the initial focus for missile defense cooperation should be on Europe, including European Russia. You might expand out from there, but that Europe seemed like a logical place to start. And then as we talked about how you would manage this missile defense, we thought having a truly joint system might be difficult in the sense that the Russians would probably not be ready, at least at the start, to report to an American commander, and the United States and NATO probably would not be ready to start to report to a Russian commander. And because of the short flight times involved, you're talking about 7 to 12 minutes. There won't be time for 2 decisions to be taken. So the idea was having perhaps not a completely joint system, but a complementary system, 2 pieces that fit up one against each other. And then the last principle dealt with the question of how do you decide who shoots? And fortunately, within a few minutes of a missile launch, you can get a pretty good idea where the missile is headed. And so the basic idea here was that if the missile track is heading towards Europe, it's an American or a NATO decision to shoot. If it's heading towards Russia, it's a Russian decision. So you could put in place a system which would allow the sides to cooperate, short of a truly joint system that doesn't prohibit from later evolving into a completely joint system, but principles that ought to be workable for the militaries on both sides. And the suggestion here was that this might be the basis for a discussion between the American side, the Russian side, the NATO side, the Russian side, as to how they could really begin to talk in a real way about truly cooperative efforts on missile defense.